A bright glowing UFO hovered over 12-year-old Ethan in the quiet town of Willow Creek, and in an instant, he was gone. For 10 long hours, his family and neighbors searched desperately, their calls echoing through the dark woods with no sign of him. When Ethan finally returned, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear, he whispered a warning so chilling it made grown men shiver. What could a young boy possibly experience that left him shaking with terror? Let us uncover what Ethan saw and how he tells everyone the alien invasion is imminent. The strange lights over Willow Creek. Lately, though, something had felt off in Willow Creek. It wasn't just Ethan who noticed it. The adults whispered about strange things, their voices dropping to hushed tones when the kids came near. Livestock had been disappearing from farms at the edge of town, leaving behind no trace. Some folks said they'd seen lights hovering over the fields late at night, bright and silent like something out of a movie. Others dismissed it as nonsense, blaming everything on coyotes or pranks. But deep down, there was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was out of place. Even the animals seemed jittery. Dogs barked at nothing, and the birds didn't sing as much as they used to. Before we dive deeper, it's clear that what happened to Ethan is far more chilling than anyone in Willow Creek could have imagined. And this won't be the only thing that will shock you. For him, these whispers and stories were both thrilling and terrifying. He'd always loved a good adventure, whether it was exploring the woods behind his house or staying up late to read comic books under the covers. But this was different. This wasn't make-believe. Something was happening, something real, and it was right here in Willow Creek. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the backyard, he was playing with his dog, Max. The air was warm and still, the kind of summer evening that felt endless. He tossed a worn tennis ball across the yard, and Max sprinted after it, his tail wagging like crazy. It was a moment of pure, simple joy, the kind that he loved. But then he saw it. Out over the field, just beyond the line of trees, a bright light appeared in the sky. At first he thought it might be a plane, but it didn't move like one. It hovered, silent and steady, glowing with an otherworldly intensity. He froze, his eyes locked on the light. Max stopped too, the ball forgotten, and let out a low growl. His heart pounded in his chest. He'd heard the stories, but he never thought he'd see something like this. The light pulsed, growing brighter, and a low humming noise filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He glanced back at the house, expecting his family to come running, but the windows were dark, and everything inside seemed perfectly normal. How could they not hear it? How could they not see it? He turned back to the light, his mind racing. Was it a helicopter? A drone? Something else? The light began to move, slowly at first, then faster, zipping across the sky in a way that defied everything he thought he knew about how things should move. It wasn't random, though. It seemed purposeful, deliberate, as if it was searching for something or someone. Max barked, breaking his trance, and the light suddenly shot upward, disappearing into the sky in the blink of an eye. The humming stopped, leaving an eerie silence in his wake. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. He wanted to run inside and tell his family, but something held him back. Would they even believe him? Would they think he was making it up? Or worse, that he'd gone crazy? As the sky darkened and the stars came out, he stayed in the backyard, his eyes scanning the horizon. He felt a strange mix of fear and excitement, like he was on the edge of something big, something that could change everything. The quiet town of Willow Creek wasn't as quiet as it seemed. Something was out there, and he had a feeling this was only the beginning. The night had deepened, the stars now blanketing the sky in a way that felt almost too perfect. Everything was still, too still, and then it happened. Out of the same spot in the sky where he had seen the strange light earlier, something began to descend. It wasn't just a light this time, it was a thing, a shape solid and undeniable. The object floated silently, as though the very laws of nature bent to its will. It was massive, yet it moved with a grace that made it seem almost alive. The body of the craft shimmered, its surface reflecting the night in ways that defied logic, as if it were made of liquid metal. Pulsing colors, blue, green, and an unearthly white, ran along its edges, casting strange shadows on the ground below. It was shaped like a flattened oval, with smooth, seamless contours that made it look unlike anything he had ever imagined. He couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his eyes locked on the descending craft. The low hum was back, but this time it carried an almost musical quality, resonating deep in his chest. Max whimpered and backed away, his tail tucked between his legs, but he couldn't look away. The object hovered just a few feet above the ground now, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. The air felt charged, like before a lightning strike, and every hair on his body stood on end. Then, without warning, a beam of light shot out from the underside of the craft. It was impossibly bright, yet it didn't hurt to look at. The light engulfed him, wrapping around him like a cocoon. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him seemed to fade, the edges of his vision blurring until there was nothing but the light. And then, he was gone. Inside the house, his family had been finishing up dinner. His father was flipping through the local news channels, and his mother was washing dishes, her mind wandering to the strange stories she'd heard lately. Emily was texting her friends, half listening to the quiet hum of the television. When the beam of light flashed outside, it lit up the kitchen like daylight, and they all froze. "What was that?" Emily said, dropping her phone. They ran to the back door, their hearts pounding. The yard was eerily quiet, the grass still glowing faintly from the strange light. Max was barking furiously now, his eyes fixed on the spot where he had been standing, but he wasn't there. All that remained was a scorched patch of grass, blackened and smoking slightly as if touched by fire. Panic set in immediately. His mother called his name, her voice cracking with desperation. His father grabbed a flashlight and ran into the field, searching wildly for any sign of him. Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her phone forgotten in her hand. Max darted back and forth, whining and sniffing the ground, but he too seemed lost. Hours passed, and there was still no sign of him. The family called the police, their voices frantic as they tried to explain what had happened. But when the authorities arrived, their reaction was far from helpful. Two officers, both with tired eyes and skeptical expressions, listened to the story with thinly veiled disbelief. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice calm but dismissive, "it's not uncommon for kids his age to run away. Are you sure he wasn't upset about something?" "Run away?" his father snapped, his voice rising. "Do you see that?" He pointed to the burnt patch of grass. "Does that look like something a runaway leaves behind?" The officers exchanged a glance. "We'll file a report," the other one said, his tone mechanical. "But if he's not back by morning, we'll need to start looking into his recent behavior. Friends, school, that sort of thing." "He didn't run away," his mother cried, her voice breaking. "Something took him. We saw the light. It was right here." But no matter how much they insisted, the authorities didn't take them seriously. To them, it was just another case of a missing kid in a small town. They promised to send out a search party in the morning, but for now, they left, leaving the family to grapple with their fear and confusion alone. As the night dragged on, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. Emily sat on the couch, clutching a blanket and staring blankly at the television, which played reruns of some old sitcom. Their father paced the living room, his fists clenching and unclenching as he muttered under his breath. Their mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she held his favorite baseball cap. Outside, the burnt patch of grass still smoldered faintly, a chilling reminder of what had happened. Max lay near the back door, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the dark yard as if he was waiting for Ethan to come back. But deep down, they all knew Ethan wasn't coming back, at least not tonight. And as the hours crept by, a new question began to take shape in their minds, a question they were too afraid to say out loud. What if he wasn't coming back at all? The next morning brought no answers, only more questions. The police returned, this time with a search team and a few reporters from the local news. They combed through the fields and woods, their dogs sniffing every inch of the ground, but they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that Ethan had ever been there. The reporters asked questions, their cameras capturing the family's tear-streaked faces in the strange burnt patch of grass. But when the story aired that evening, it was framed as a possible runaway case, with only a brief mention of the unexplained scorch marks. The townspeople were sympathetic at first, but as the days turned into weeks, their interest waned. People began to whisper behind the family's back, speculating about what might have happened. Some said Ethan had run away. Others hinted at darker theories, blaming the parents or suggesting that he'd fallen victim to a wild animal. But no one talked about the lights, the hum, or the craft. No one wanted to believe that something unexplainable had happened in their quiet little town. For Ethan's family, life became a blur of grief and frustration. They put up flyers, called every friend and neighbor, and even reached out to experts in strange phenomena. But nothing brought them closer to finding Ethan. The only thing they had left was the scorched patch of grass, a haunting reminder of the night everything changed. And yet, as the days went by, Ethan's mother began to notice something strange. The grass around the burnt area was growing back faster than it should have, and it wasn't the same as before. It was thicker, darker, almost unnatural in its vibrancy. She didn't tell anyone at first, afraid they'd think she was losing her mind, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something important. He was gone, but the world around him was starting to change, and whatever had taken him wasn't finished yet. While the town searched for Ethan, the strange things they found made them realize something bigger was going on. Whispers in the dark woods. The morning after Ethan disappeared, the town of Willow Creek woke up to a palpable sense of unease. Word had spread quickly about the boy's vanishing, and by sunrise, the streets were filled with neighbors and friends ready to help. The community, tight-knit and always quick to rally in times of trouble, had gathered at the family's house, offering everything from flashlights to casseroles. The local police, now under pressure to act, had expanded their search efforts, marking a radius around the field where he was last seen. The first day of the search felt hopeful. Volunteers combed the woods, their voices calling his name echoing through the trees. But as the hours dragged on, hope began to wane. Search dogs led their handlers in circles, unable to pick up a consistent scent. Tracks that looked promising at first turned out to be dead ends. And then there were the whispers, the ones about the strange things people were finding. "It's not normal," Mrs. Henderson, the town's oldest resident, muttered to anyone who would listen. She'd been sitting on her porch the night he vanished and swore she'd seen glowing orbs flitting through the trees. Others began sharing similar accounts. Some had heard a low, droning hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A few even claimed to have seen what looked like footprints, but they were too large, too deep, and had a strange clawed shape that no one could identify. The local forest, normally a serene and familiar place, started to feel alien. The birds were quieter than usual, their songs replaced by an unsettling stillness. Small animals darted across the searchers' paths, their movements jittery and unnatural. Some volunteers reported their flashlights flickering or their radios cutting out without explanation. One man's cell phone screen went completely black when he entered a clearing, only to turn back on as soon as he left. By the second day, the tension in Willow Creek was impossible to ignore. A storm was rolling in, the sky darkening with heavy clouds, but no one was ready to give up. The sheriff, a practical man with years of experience, tried to keep everyone focused. "We stick to the facts," he said firmly, though even he couldn't deny that something about this case felt off. The scorched patch of grass where the boy had vanished was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and the unusual reports from his team were piling up. In the woods, the searchers stumbled upon more strange clues. A tree, stripped of its bark in perfectly symmetrical lines, stood in the middle of an otherwise untouched grove. A circle of mushrooms, larger and more vibrant than any they'd ever seen, seemed to pulse faintly with light. And then there were the scratches, long, deep gouges in the trunks of trees, arranged in patterns that looked almost intentional. One volunteer swore he felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, though no one else noticed it. Back in town, the power outages started. At first, they were brief and localized, a few flickering streetlights here, a single house going dark there. But by the evening, entire blocks were losing electricity. The local diner, a central hub for the search effort, became chaotic as its lights cut out and its appliances buzzed erratically. People's phones were losing battery life at an alarming rate, and the old analog clock in the town square began spinning wildly before stopping altogether. The wildlife was behaving strangely too. Crows gathered in massive flocks, their cries loud and frantic as they swooped over the fields. Deer, normally skittish, stood frozen in place, their heads turning sharply to follow sounds no one else could hear. Even the family's dog, Max, refused to leave the backyard, growling at the woods whenever anyone tried to coax him out. By the third day, exhaustion was setting in. The volunteers, though still determined, were beginning to look over their shoulders more often. The forest felt heavier, darker, as though it were watching them. Even the most skeptical among them were starting to admit that something unnatural was happening. "It's not just a missing kid anymore," one man whispered to his wife as they trudged back to town. "It's something else, something worse." That night, the sheriff decided to call in reinforcements. A team of state investigators arrived, armed with more resources and a dismissive attitude toward the local stories. But even they couldn't ignore the evidence. Their sophisticated equipment, drones, thermal cameras, and motion sensors malfunctioned in the woods. A drone sent to scan the area from above lost connection mid-flight and crashed without explanation. The thermal cameras picked up strange heat signatures that moved too fast and disappeared too suddenly to be animals. As the search expanded, so did the strangeness. Reports of glowing orbs increased, with more people claiming to see them darting between the trees. The orbs seemed to respond to movement, hovering just out of reach before vanishing. One witness described them as like fireflies but wrong. Another claimed they saw one pass through a tree as if it wasn't solid. Theories began to swirl among the searchers. Some said it was aliens, pointing to the stories of UFOs and lights from weeks before. Others thought it might be some kind of government experiment, though no one could explain why it would happen in Willow Creek. A few even whispered about old legends, stories of spirits and guardians tied to the forest. But no one had answers, and the lack of explanation only made things worse. Meanwhile, his family was unraveling. His mother barely slept, spending her nights staring at the burnt patch of grass as if willing him to reappear. His father threw himself into the search, his determination bordering on desperation. Emily, once the practical one, had started keeping a notebook of all the strange things people were reporting, convinced they were pieces of a larger problem. But as the days dragged on, hope began to feel like a crude joke. On the fifth day, a storm finally broke over Willow Creek, bringing with it heavy rain and howling winds. The search had to be paused, the forest too dangerous to navigate, but the storm brought something else too, a new clue. Lightning struck a tree near the edge of the woods, splitting it down the middle. When the rain let up and the searchers returned, they found something inside the hollowed-out trunk, a piece of fabric, torn and dirty, but unmistakably from the boy's shirt. The discovery reignited the search, but it also deepened the questions. How had the fabric ended up there? The tree had been standing for decades, its hollow unreachable until the lightning strike. And yet there it was, as though placed there deliberately. The sheriff ordered the area to be searched thoroughly, but once again, they found nothing. As night fell, the sense of dread in Willow Creek grew heavier. The searchers began to wonder if they were looking for a boy or for answers to something far beyond their understanding. The forest, the lights, the sounds, it all felt like pieces of a story no one wanted to tell. And as the crows gathered once more, their cries echoing through the stormy night, one thing became clear. Whatever had taken him wasn't done yet. The fourth night after the boy's disappearance stretched on with an unbearable stillness. Inside the family's modest home, the weight of his absence pressed down on every room. The kitchen table, where he'd once shared meals and laughter, now felt like a hollow reminder of what was missing. His mother, Linda, sat in the dim light of the living room, her hands trembling as she clutched a framed photo of him. She hadn't slept more than a few hours since he vanished, and her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale. The silence in the house was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant hum of the refrigerator. His father, Mark, had thrown himself into the search, but now, as the hours dragged past midnight, even his resolve was fraying. He paced back and forth in the small living room, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. Every so often he would glance out the window, hoping to see some sign, any sign that his son would come running up the driveway. But the street outside was dark and empty, the shadows stretching long under the faint glow of the streetlights. Emily, his older sister, had retreated to her bedroom, though sleep was out of the question. Her room, usually a sanctuary of teenage normalcy, felt alien to her now. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with memories of her brother. She thought about how he used to barge into her room uninvited, always full of questions about her music or her homework. The thought brought tears to her eyes, and she wiped them away angrily, frustrated at her own helplessness. The family's dog, Max, lay curled up near the back door, his ears perked and his eyes fixed on the dark yard. He'd been restless ever since the boy disappeared, refusing to leave the spot where he had last been seen. Occasionally, he would let out a low whine or growl, as if sensing something the others couldn't. Linda found some small comfort in his presence, though it was fleeting. Even Max seemed powerless against whatever force had taken her son. Meanwhile, the town of Willow Creek buzzed with speculation. The initial shock of the disappearance had given way to rumors and theories, many of them wild and outlandish. Some townsfolk whispered about UFOs, recounting the strange lights and noises they had seen in the weeks leading up to the incident. Others dismissed these ideas outright, calling them nonsense, meant to distract from the real explanations. Kids run away all the time, one neighbor had said at the grocery store. It's tragic, but it happens. But not everyone was so quick to dismiss the unusual reports. A small group of townspeople began meeting in the shadows, sharing their experiences and piecing together the strange occurrences. They talked about the burnt patch of grass in the yard, the odd electrical failures, and the bizarre behavior of the local wildlife. One man claimed to have seen something in the sky that night, a craft unlike anything he'd ever imagined. Another woman swore she'd heard a low hum coming from the woods, a sound that made her skin crawl. Back at the house, the family's anguish deepened as the hours dragged on. Linda finally rose from her seat, unable to bear the stillness any longer. She wandered into the kitchen and began tidying up, though there wasn't much to do. Her hands shook as she wiped down the counters, the repetitive motion giving her a momentary distraction. Mark followed her, his voice low and strained as he spoke. "We'll find him," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he said them. "We have to." Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "Do you think he's—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Her parents looked at her, their expressions a mixture of pain and determination. "We don't know," Linda said softly, her voice trembling, "but we can't give up." As the clock ticked past 2 a.m, the family gathered in the living room, unable to sleep but too exhausted to do anything else. They sat in silence, the air heavy with unspoken fears. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made them jump. The minutes dragged into hours, and the weight of the unknown grew heavier with each passing moment. At one point, Linda thought she heard something outside, a faint hum, low and steady. She froze, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. But when she looked out the window, the yard was empty, the night as still as ever. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. By 4 a.m, the family's exhaustion reached its peak. Mark dozed off in his chair, his head slumped forward and his breathing heavy. Linda sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the photograph of her son she'd placed on the coffee table. Emily had curled up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her and her arms wrapped around a pillow. Even Max had settled down, though his ears still twitched at every sound. But sleep, when it came, was restless and fleeting. Linda dreamed of her son, standing in the backyard with the light shining down on him. In the dream, she reached out to him, but he was just out of reach, his face blurred and distant. She woke with a start, her heart racing and her cheeks damp with tears. The room was still dark, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to creep through the windows. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the family stirred, their exhaustion giving way to a grim determination. The search for their son wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as they prepared to face another day, a new question lingered in the back of their minds, one they couldn't ignore. What if the answers they were searching for weren't the ones they wanted to find? No one was ready for the moment Ethan came back, bringing more than anyone could have expected. The reckoning they didn't see coming. The first rays of dawn stretched over the town of Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. In the backyard of Ethan's house, the spot where he had vanished 4 nights ago remained untouched, save for the now overgrown, unnaturally green grass that surrounded the scorched patch. The family had only just begun to stir, their restless night leaving them hollow-eyed and weary. But as the sun broke over the horizon, something stirred in the yard. Without warning, a faint hum filled the air, low and rhythmic, almost imperceptible at first. The grass in the scorched patch seemed to shimmer, and then it happened. A sudden flash of light erupted, so bright it could have blinded anyone who saw it. The hum grew louder, resonating through the house and jolting everyone awake. When the light faded, Ethan was there. He stood in the exact spot where he had disappeared, trembling and dazed. His clothes were the same, though torn and dirtied, and his skin was deathly pale, almost translucent in the morning light. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes, once bright and full of curiosity, were now dull and distant, as though they belonged to someone much older. For a moment he swayed on his feet, then collapsed to his knees. Linda was the first to reach him, her scream piercing the early morning silence. "Ethan!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him and pulling him into her arms. His body was cold to the touch, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Mark and Emily were close behind, their faces a mixture of relief and terror as they took in the sight of him. "What happened? Where were you?" Mark demanded, though his voice cracked with emotion. But the boy didn't answer. His lips moved soundlessly, his gaze fixed on something far away. It was as if he couldn't hear them, or perhaps he didn't know how to respond. It was Emily who noticed the marks first. "Mom, look at his arms," she said, her voice trembling. Linda pulled back slightly, her breath catching as she saw the strange, intricate patterns etched into his skin. The markings were unlike anything she'd ever seen, a series of geometric shapes and symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. They covered both of his arms from wrist to shoulder, and they looked as though they had been burned into his flesh. The family brought him inside, wrapping him in blankets and trying to warm his chilled body. He remained silent for hours, his eyes vacant and his movements sluggish. The local doctor was called, but even he was at a loss. "This boy needs more help than I can give," he admitted, shaking his head. "Those marks, I've never seen anything like them. As the day wore on, he began to speak, though his voice was low and distant, as if he was speaking from somewhere far away. His words came in fragments, disjointed and cryptic, but they painted a picture of something unimaginable. "They took me," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "I don't know where. It wasn't here. It wasn't anywhere." His voice wavered, and he shivered under the blankets. It was dark, so dark, but there was light too. It spoke to me. "Who spoke to you?" Linda asked gently, though her voice shook. He turned his head toward her, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time. "Them," he said simply. "They're not like us. They're watching, waiting." Mark clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. "Who are they? What are you talking about?" But his focus drifted away again, his gaze growing distant once more. "The reckoning," he murmured, "is coming. They showed me. They said we're not ready." The family exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of his cryptic warnings. Emily, clutching her notebook, began scribbling down everything he said, determined to make sense of it later. But as the hours passed, his words grew more unsettling. "They'll come back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for me, for everyone. The date, it's soon, so soon." Outside, the skies began to darken unnaturally, the clouds thick and heavy despite the morning sun. The air felt charged, electric, as though another storm was brewing. Max, the family dog, paced anxiously, whining and pawing at the door. The family tried to comfort him, but his trembling only grew worse, and the strange markings on his arms seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if alive. By evening, the news of his return had spread through the town, and curious neighbors began to gather outside the house. The whispers about UFOs and otherworldly phenomena grew louder, and the tension in Willow Creek reached a breaking point. The sheriff, though skeptical of the more outlandish theories, arrived to ensure the family had some privacy, but even he couldn't ignore the strange atmosphere that seemed to hang over the town. That night, as the family huddled together in the living room, he spoke one final warning before falling into a deep, restless sleep. "Don't trust the lights," he said, his voice barely audible. "When they come back, you'll know, but it'll be too late." Linda stayed awake long after the others had fallen asleep, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to her son was far from over. The marks on his arms, the changes in his behavior, his cryptic words, they all pointed to something bigger, something beyond her comprehension. As the clock ticked toward midnight, she glanced out the window and saw, for just a moment, a faint glow in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she looked again, it was gone. His return was not the end of their ordeal. It was only the beginning. The morning after his unsettling return, the house was silent except for the occasional rustle of wind against the windows. He sat at the kitchen table, his frail hands cradling a steaming mug of tea. His pale skin seemed even more washed out in the morning light, and the strange markings on his arms glowed faintly with an otherworldly shimmer. His family hovered around him, afraid to push too hard, but desperate for answers. He stared at his tea, his lips pressed together as if weighing the words he needed to say. "They weren't human," he said finally, his voice raspy and distant. The room went still, every ear straining to catch his words. "They were tall, so tall. Their arms were long and their fingers, too many. They didn't walk like us. They floated, moved like shadows." Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Mark's knuckles turned white as he gripped the back of a chair. Emily, clutching her notebook, leaned in closer, her pen trembling over the page. His eyes flicked to her, and for a moment they seemed to focus. "I don't think they're evil," he said, "but they're not kind either. They're curious, watching, waiting." "Watching for what?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze drifted away again, his eyes unfocused as if staring into a place only he could see. "They showed me things," he said. "Flashes of light, symbols, a world so different from ours. I couldn't understand it, but it felt huge, endless." And then they spoke, not with words, but with thoughts, images, feelings. Linda sat down beside him, her trembling hand reaching for his. "What did they tell you?" she asked softly. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as if the memories were too painful to recall. "They said we're on the brink," he murmured, "that we've been given so many chances, but we keep failing. They showed me our wars, the way we tear each other apart over nothing. They showed me forests burning, oceans choking, animals dying. It's all connected," they said, "and we're running out of time." Emily's pen scratched furiously against the paper as she tried to keep up. "They're warning us?" she asked. He nodded, though it seemed to take great effort. "They said if we don't change, we'll destroy ourselves. They won't intervene. They'll just let it happen, because it's our fault, our responsibility." The room fell into a heavy silence. The weight of his words pressed down on them, filling the air with a suffocating sense of dread. Linda looked at Mark, her eyes pleading for some kind of reassurance, but he had none to give. Instead, he turned to his son, his voice steady but firm. "Did they say how much time we have?" His eyes opened, and for the first time since his return, they were clear and sharp. "They gave me a date," he said, his voice trembling. "June 24th, 2031. That's when it happens. That's when everything changes." Linda's breath hitched. "That's only 9 years," she whispered. Mark's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Emily's pen stilled, hovering over the page as she processed what her brother had just said. "What happens on that date?" Mark asked. Ethan hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "They showed me flashes, chaos, fire, cities falling, but it wasn't clear. It was like they wanted me to understand, but not too much. They said it depends on us, on whether we change." The family sat in stunned silence, the enormity of Ethan's revelation sinking in. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and making the house feel even more isolated. Linda clutched her son's hand, her mind racing with questions and fears. Was this real? Could it be true? And if it was, what could they possibly do to stop it? Over the next few days, Ethan's fragmented story spread through the town, sparking both fascination and fear. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized boy, while others saw it as a dire warning. The strange symbols on Ethan's arms became the subject of intense speculation, with some claiming they were alien messages and others suggesting they were a manifestation of his subconscious. Experts were called in, but no one could explain their origin or their faint, pulsing glow. Meanwhile, Ethan's behavior remained erratic. He spoke in riddles, his voice often trailing off, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. He refused to go near the backyard, and every time the faint hum returned, he would curl into a ball, covering his ears and rocking back and forth. "They're still watching," he said one night, his voice barely audible. "They're waiting to see what we'll do." The family struggled to make sense of it all. Mark threw himself into research, poring over books and online forums about UFOs, prophecies, and environmental crises. Linda tried to shield Ethan from the prying eyes of the town, but the whispers followed them everywhere. Emily became obsessed with documenting everything, her notebook filling with Ethan's words, drawings of the symbols, and clippings from old newspaper articles about unexplained phenomena. But as the days turned into weeks, one question loomed larger than all of the others. Could they do anything to change the future Ethan had seen? And if they could, where would they even begin? The answer, it seemed, lay not in what they knew, but in what they were willing to do. As June 24th, 2031 drew closer, The family and the world would have to confront the horrifying truth. Their fate was in their own hands. When he returned, his words shook the town and changed how people saw everything around them. The town that became a spotlight. The quiet town of Willow Creek was never the same after Ethan's return. What had once been a sleepy, overlooked corner of the world now found itself in the crosshairs of a global frenzy. Reporters from every major network descended on the town, cameras rolling as they interviewed neighbors, scoured the woods, and camped outside the family's home. UFO enthusiasts, conspiracy theorists, and self-proclaimed experts swarmed the streets, each claiming to have answers about what had happened. Some carried signs proclaiming Ethan as a messenger, while others demanded the government tell the truth about extraterrestrial life. Ethan, despite his reluctance, became a reluctant figurehead for the chaos. News outlets plastered his pale, solemn face across their screens, dissecting every word he'd said since his return. The strange symbols on his arms were analyzed endlessly, with theories ranging from alien languages to genetic mutations. Ethan rarely left the house, overwhelmed by the attention and the conflicting emotions it stirred. His parents tried to shield him, but it was impossible to escape the frenzy entirely. Meanwhile, scientists and researchers arrived in droves, eager to examine the boy who had seemingly vanished into thin air and returned with a warning for humanity. Ethan underwent a battery of tests, from blood work to brain scans, each yielding more questions than answers. His DNA showed subtle anomalies, patterns that didn't align with anything known in the human genome. His brain activity was off the charts, with regions lighting up that typically lay dormant. One neurologist described it as a brain operating at twice its normal capacity, but the most unsettling finding came from his physical body. The markings on his arms defied explanation. They weren't tattoos or scars, but something else entirely, a layer of tissue that seemed both organic and inorganic, as though it had been fused into his skin. When researchers tried to take samples, the markings reacted, glowing faintly and sending jolts of energy through their instruments. The data was so bizarre that it divided the scientific community. Some saw it as evidence of advanced technology, while others dismissed it as a hoax or an unexplainable anomaly. As the days turned into weeks, the division in Willow Creek deepened. On one side were the believers, who saw Ethan as a harbinger of a greater truth. They gathered in groups, holding vigils and discussing ways to prepare for the date of reckoning Ethan had mentioned. Some spoke of changing their lives, abandoning materialism, and focusing on sustainability. Others delved into conspiracy theories, claiming the government was hiding crucial information and that Ethan's warning was proof of an impending alien invasion. On the other side were the skeptics, who dismissed the entire ordeal as hysteria. They pointed to the lack of concrete evidence, the wild theories that had sprung up, and the fact that Ethan's story couldn't be corroborated. "It's just a kid with a vivid imagination," one local businessman said during an interview. "People are desperate for something to believe in, and this is just the latest thing." The division tore at the fabric of the community. Longtime friends stopped speaking to each other, families argued over dinner tables, and tensions simmered in every corner of the town. Even within Ethan's family, the strain was palpable. Mark, ever the pragmatist, struggled to reconcile what he had seen with his rational mind. Linda, on the other hand, became deeply invested in Ethan's story, seeing it as a call to action. Emily, caught between her parents, focused on documenting everything, determined to make sense of the chaos. The media frenzy only amplified the divide. Talk shows and podcasts debated Ethan's story endlessly, with some hailing him as a prophet and others branding him a fraud. Documentaries were produced, featuring grainy footage of the woods and interviews with neighbors who offered conflicting accounts of that fateful night. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like #EthanSpeaks and #UFOHoax trending worldwide. For every person who believed Ethan's story, there was another who ridiculed it. Through it all, Ethan remained withdrawn, his health deteriorating under the weight of the scrutiny. He spoke less and less, retreating into himself as the noise around him grew louder. The once vibrant boy who had loved exploring the woods and playing with his dog now seemed like a shadow of his former self. Even Max, his loyal companion, seemed unsettled, pacing the house and whining at unseen things. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a warm golden glow, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. "They're still watching," he said, his eyes fixed on the window. "They're waiting to see what we'll do." His words sent a chill through the family. Linda moved to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What do they want, Ethan?" she asked gently. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "They want us to change," he said, "before it's too late." Outside, the town buzzed with activity, the lines between believers and skeptics growing ever starker. But within the walls of Ethan's home, the message was clear. Whatever the truth behind his experience, it was a warning that could not be ignored. The date Ethan had spoken of loomed closer with each passing day, and Willow Creek became a town on edge. The atmosphere was a volatile mix of fear, hope, and outright denial. For Ethan's family, life had become a balancing act between preparing for the unknown and navigating the relentless scrutiny of the townsfolk. The divide in the community had grown deeper, with some residents joining the family in their preparations, while others mocked them openly. Linda threw herself into the preparations with a fervor that bordered on desperation. She stocked up on supplies, filling the basement with canned food, water, and first aid kits. She scoured every article and video she could find about survival tactics, alien encounters, and apocalyptic scenarios. Mark, though less vocal in his beliefs, supported her efforts, spending his evenings reinforcing windows and securing the house against what he described as a precaution. Even Emily had joined in, documenting everything meticulously in her notebooks while trying to connect the dots in Ethan's fragmented warnings. But not everyone in Willow Creek shared their urgency. For every person who joined the family's efforts, there were two more who dismissed them as paranoid. Neighbors rolled their eyes at Linda's frantic preparations and whispered about the doomsday cult forming around Ethan's story. The local diner became a hotspot for heated debates, with believers and skeptics clashing over coffee and pie. "It's just a kid with an overactive imagination," one man scoffed, shaking his head. "This town's going crazy over nothing." "And what if it's not nothing?" another countered, her voice rising. "What if he's right? Are you willing to take that chance?" As the arguments grew louder, so did the sightings. Reports of strange lights in the sky began to pour in, not just from Willow Creek, but from neighboring towns as well. People described glowing orbs that hovered silently before darting off at impossible speeds. Others claimed to have seen larger crafts, their surfaces shimmering like liquid metal, moving with an eerie, deliberate precision. The sightings were often accompanied by strange phenomena, power outages, animals behaving erratically, and an inexplicable hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. One evening, a group of teenagers ventured into the woods with their phones, hoping to capture evidence of the lights. They returned pale and shaken, their videos showing faint flickering shapes in the sky and a low resonating hum that grew louder before abruptly stopping. "It's real," one of them whispered, his voice trembling. "Whatever it is, it's real." The growing number of sightings only added to the tension in the town. The believers saw them as confirmation of Ethan's warnings, while the skeptics dismissed them as hoaxes or natural phenomena blown out of proportion. The local police, overwhelmed and underprepared, struggled to maintain order as the town's divisions threatened to boil over. Fights broke out in the streets, and friendships crumbled under the weight of differing beliefs. For Ethan, the approaching date brought no comfort. He spent most of his days in silence, his once vivid descriptions giving way to an unsettling quiet. The markings on his arms continued to glow faintly, their patterns shifting subtly in ways no one could explain. He rarely left his room, and when he did, it was only to stare out of the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, Ethan finally spoke. "They're closer," he said, his voice low and trembling. "I can feel them." Linda leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean, Ethan?" she asked. He shook his head, his eyes wide and filled with fear. "They're watching. They're waiting to see if we'll listen, but most of them don't believe. They think it's a joke. It's not a joke." His words sent a chill through the room, and the family exchanged nervous glances. Outside, the wind howled, and the faint hum they'd come to associate with the sighting seemed to vibrate through the house. Max, the family dog, whined and pawed at the door, his unease mirroring their own. As the date drew closer, the tension in Willow Creek reached a breaking point. The town was a powder keg, with emotions running high on all sides. The believers grew more vocal, organizing meetings and vigils to prepare for what they called the reckoning. They lit candles, shared survival tips, and prayed for guidance. The skeptics, meanwhile, became increasingly antagonistic, accusing the believers of spreading fear and chaos. On the night before the date Ethan had warned about, the town was eerily quiet. The streets, usually bustling with activity, were deserted as people huddled in their homes, waiting for what was to come. The air was heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. The sky was clear, the stars shining brightly, but there was an unnatural stillness that set everyone on edge. In the family's home, the atmosphere was tense, but resolute. Linda double-checked their supplies, her hands shaking as she moved from room to room. Mark stood by the window, his eyes scanning the dark yard for any sign of movement. Emily sat beside Ethan, her notebook open on her lap as she tried to piece together his cryptic warnings. And Ethan, pale and trembling, stared at the markings on his arms, his lips moving silently as if reciting a prayer. As the clock struck midnight, a low hum filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. The lights in the house flickered, and the family froze, their eyes widening in fear. Outside, the sky seemed to come alive, glowing with an unearthly light that bathed the town in an otherworldly hue. The hum intensified, vibrating through the walls and shaking the very ground beneath their feet. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The light faded, the hum ceased, and the house fell into an eerie silence. The family exchanged nervous glances, their hearts pounding in their chests. Whatever was coming, they knew it was only a matter of time. The morning of June 24th dawned heavy with anticipation. A thick, unnatural mist blanketed Willow Creek, muting the sounds of the waking world. The townsfolk, whether believers or skeptics, felt the weight of the day hanging over them. At the center of it all was Ethan's family, their home bustling with nervous energy as they prepared to make their way to the field where Ethan had vanished. It had become a makeshift gathering place for the town, the scorched patch of grass, a grim reminder of the boy's ordeal and the warnings he delivered. By noon, a crowd had assembled at the site. Some carried signs with messages of hope, others stood with arms crossed, their skepticism etched across their faces. Cameras from local news stations lined the perimeter, reporters whispering into microphones as they waited for something, anything, to happen. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mixture of fear, doubt, and a strange collective anticipation. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, his frail frame wrapped in a thick jacket despite the warm weather. The markings on his arms glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with an invisible force. His eyes, glassy and distant, were fixed on the horizon. Linda hovered close by, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Mark and Emily stood nearby, their faces drawn and pale as they watched the crowd grow larger. By mid-afternoon, the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, their edges tinged with an otherworldly green. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the crowd like an invisible weight. A low hum began to rise, faint at first but unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground and into the bones of those gathered. People began to murmur, their voices tinged with unease. "Look!" someone shouted, pointing toward the horizon. In the distance, glowing lights began to appear. At first they were small and faint, like stars flickering against the dark clouds, but as they drew closer, their intensity grew, bathing the landscape in an eerie, shifting light. The shapes were indistinct, their edges blurred and constantly shifting, but there was no mistaking their purposefulness. They moved with a deliberate grace, their movements defying the natural laws of the world. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath caught in their throats. Even the skeptics, who had come prepared to mock and ridicule, found themselves frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes from the approaching phenomenon. The hum grew louder, its vibrations deep and resonant, as if the earth itself was trembling in anticipation. Ethan began to move. His steps were slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on the glowing lights as he made his way to the center of the scorched patch of grass. Linda called out to him, her voice trembling with fear, but he didn't respond. Mark grabbed her arm, holding her back as Ethan reached the center and turned to face the crowd. His face was calm, almost serene, but his voice, when he spoke, carried an urgency that sent chills through everyone present. "They are here," he said, his voice resonating over the hum. "They have come to see if we have listened, if we are ready to change." The crowd shifted uneasily, their murmurs growing louder. "Change what?" someone shouted. "What does this mean?" Ethan's gaze swept over the crowd, his expression unreadable. "They showed me everything," he continued. "The wars, the greed, the way we've poisoned our world and each other. They warned us, gave us time to make it right, but they said if we failed, there would be no more chances." As he spoke, the lights grew brighter, their glow bathing the crowd in a strange, ethereal light. The hum reached a deafening pitch, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Some people screamed, others dropped to their knees, their faces buried in their hands. The skeptics, once so confident in their disbelief, now looked pale and shaken, their bravado stripped away by the sheer enormity of what was happening. Ethan's voice rose above the chaos, clear and unwavering. "This is your final warning," he said. "Change or face the reckoning." And then everything changed. The lights, which had been growing steadily brighter, suddenly converged, forming a massive, pulsating sphere above the field. The hum ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the world. The crowd stared in awe and terror as the sphere began to descend, its glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. Ethan stood motionless, his arms outstretched as the sphere descended around him. The markings on his skin glowed brighter than ever, their patterns shifting and swirling in ways that seemed almost alive. Linda screamed, breaking free from Mark's grip and running toward her son, but a sudden burst of light stopped her in her tracks. She shielded her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she called out to him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light was gone. When the crowd dared to open their eyes, Ethan was gone. The sphere had vanished, leaving only a faint glow in the air and a silence that felt heavy with unanswered questions. The crowd erupted into chaos, some crying, others shouting, and still others standing in stunned silence. Linda collapsed to the ground, her sobs racking her body as Mark held her tightly. Emily stood frozen, her notebook clutched to her chest, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. Above them, the sky began to clear, the dark clouds dissipating as quickly as they had come. The sun broke through, its warm rays feeling almost alien after the events of the day, but the sense of relief was fleeting, replaced by an overwhelming uncertainty. What had they just witnessed? What did it mean, and what would come next? As the crowd began to disperse, the whispers started. Some claimed it was a sign of salvation, a second chance for humanity to right its wrongs. Others saw it as a harbinger of doom, a final warning before the end, and some, still clinging to their skepticism, dismissed it as a mass hallucination, a trick of the light and sound. But for Ethan's family, there was no denying the truth. Whatever had happened, it was real, and whatever came next, they would have to face it together, carrying the weight of his final words, change or face the reckoning. Is Ethan's warning just a child's imagination, or could it reveal a terrifying truth about alien encounters? Tell us what you think, and remember to like and subscribe for more.